Hey there everyone, this is Samuel Johnson and welcome to the MCU Perspectives, What If Edition. And today, we're going to be discussing the very first episode of Marvel's What If. What if Captain Carter were the first Avenger? Now, before I begin the vlog proper, I just want to give a warning. If you haven't seen the episode yet, turn back now. I'm going to be spoiling the plot rotten, so if you don't want the episode ruined for you, go watch it right now. I'll still be here when you get back, okay? Okay. Anyway, so before we get to the plot summary, let's talk about Captain America. Now, odds are you know the story, but if you don't, let's jog your memory. Captain America, of course, as you know, was a man from Brooklyn by the name of Steve Rogers. During World War II, he tried to enlist in the army, but because of his poor physical condition, he was continuously denied. He was too short, too skinny, he had asthma, they thought he wouldn't last a minute. However, Steve's determination got the attention of one Dr. Abraham Erskine, who decided to give Steve special permission to enlist. And the reason for this is because he saw something in Steve that he didn't see in other soldiers. A heart, a determination, a willingness to do good. And so he believed that Steve would be the perfect candidate for his super soldier serum, which when injected into someone would enhance their physical capabilities to superhuman levels. And as he put it, it would also bring out more of what was inside. Bad would become worse, or in Steve's case, good would become great. As such, Steve, of course, was given the serum, and it transformed him into the peak of human physicality, and he became Captain America, hero of the people, beater of Nazi agents and Hydra, pretty much just this all-around great superhero who, unfortunately, was taken out of time due to a Hydra plot that he had to stop, and wound up waking up in the modern day, pretty much leaving everybody he ever cared about behind, but still keeping on the good fight and doing his best to carry on and be a hero. However, let's rewind the story a little. Specifically, back to when Steve was given the serum. Now, if you've seen Captain America: The First Avenger, or any Marvel movie featuring Captain America, you know that one of Steve's primary love interest was a woman by the name of Peggy Carter, a secret agent who Steve had gotten the chance to know, and ultimately, and the two wound up growing closer and formed a romantic relationship. She was there for him through every step of his journey, but the thing is, what if she was there? What if she was in the room when Steve got the serum? Because that's what happens in this case. In this reality, while Howard Stark and all the various engineers are getting the Super Soldier Project ready, Peggy Carter is, of course, asked to leave the room because, again, it's the 1940s and women are still those creatures with the things on their chests. But in this reality, Peggy decided, no, I think I'll stay. As such, things went as they did in the main MCU. They were Dr. Erskine was giving the presentation. Steve was getting prepped to get this to get this serum injected into him. However, as things went along, Peggy began looking around and noticed some oddities in the room. She saw an explosive device on the computer terminals, and that in turn led her looking around the room, and that's of course where she saw the Hydra spy. As such, in this reality, rather than waiting until after Steve got injected to activate the bomb, the guy activates it immediately. And a lot of people end up dying, including Dr. Erskine, as in the main MCU. As such, when things go wrong, the guy the Hydra agent charges to where the serum would have been injected into Steve, takes out some of the serum and tries to run for it, but Steve, being Steve, tries to run up to the guy and take him out, and Steve's taken down in one shot, just falling to the ground. Peggy, of course, immediately sees that Steve's in trouble, so she immediately pulls her gun on the Hydra agent and shoots him before he can escape. But it's clear that with Steve's injuries, he cannot have the serum. So and unfortunately, they're losing power. So if they want to get a super soldier, someone needs to act quickly. And unfortunately, the candidate pool is kind of small. Howard says he can't do it because he pushes buttons. Steve can't do it because of his injury, as I just said. So Peggy decides, screw it, I'll go in. And while the general in charge tries to stop her, she just outright ignores him and jumps into the pod, and Howard gets everything in motion. The serum is injected into her, and just like with Steve in the main MCU timeline, she gets buffed up, taller, stronger, just more powerful. And this, my friend, is the birth of this reality's Captain America, Captain Carter. And just like with the MCU, the guy in charge thinks that she's an embarrassment. He thinks that since just like with the main MCU, Dr. Erskine's death means they cannot reproduce the super soldier serum, since he kept the formula in his head for security reasons. And again, because of the aforementioned prejudice, he thinks that Peggy can't be out in the field, that she just be an embarrassment, that women don't belong in the field, blah blah blah. So just like with the main just like in the MCU, they take some of her blood to see if they can find a way to replicate the super soldier serum, much like what they did. Which, if this is anything like the main timeline, it will eventually result in the Abomination and the Red Guardian. But just like with the main timeline, Carter is just thrown on the sidelines with the full intent of having her doing that same stupid sideshow that Steve was doing in the main timeline. However, it does allow her to get some moments in with Steve, because while he's recuperating, she's training with him, and Steve pretty much tells her, and while she feels guilty for taking Steve's chance away from him, he's not angry at all. It's like, yeah, I had that chance, but now it's your turn to be the hero. So pretty much, like, it's just some nice, more sweet moments between them, and ultimately, though, Peggy is still that much more irritated, especially as things continue matching up with the main timeline, as things begin matching up with the main timeline, specifically with the Red Skull, as, just like in the main timeline, he's on the hunt for the Tesseract, which he believes will give him ultimate power, and ultimately allow him to ascend to godhood and all that BS that he had before. And as such, in this timeline, the government actually does hear about his excursions into Norway, and Howard and Peggy do say that they could send a battalion out, but the general in charge thinks that'd be stupid, a waste of resources, and that he thinks that they might as well just let them take it. By the time they figure out how to crack the Tesseract, the war would be over, and it won't be any threat to them. And as such, Peggy, of course, is just mulling and angry about this, but Howard Stark, being Howard Stark, says, why don't we do it anyway? As such, he presents Peggy with a costume, which was supposed to be her costume for her tour, and while Steve had the USA star on this, in her case, it's a Union Jack. And on top, and make even better, this time it comes pre-equipped with the kick-ass shield, which again also has the Union Jack. As such, Peggy says, screw it, I'll go in anyway, and so she charges in and manages to intercept the Tesseract before it can reach the Red Skull, taking out the battalion of Hydra soldiers there, and even managing to capture, I forgot his name. Let's see. I knew it too. What was it again? Zola. She managed to capture Zola and deliver the Tesseract straight to the general. And while the general, of course, is just like flabbergasted, Peggy Carter makes it clear she is not going anywhere, and she is ready to kick major ass. As such, with the Tesseract on America's side, Peggy continues her escapade as she continues being a one-woman army against the various Nazis and Hydra agents. And of course she's kicking ass, and of course she's just being awesome while she does it. However, one major difference between this reality and the main timeline is that since the Allies have the Tesseract now, Howard immediately begins putting it to work, as he uses the Tesseract and puts it in something that he says will allow Steve to fight in the war. However, as he's getting it ready, Peggy, Steve, Howard, and the rest of their battalion hear about the 107th being captured, just like in the main timeline. And just like in the main timeline, with Steve, Peggy decides that she'll go in and save the 107th. Although in this timeline, she manages to get there before Bucky can be experimented on and have the mental commands that would have turned him into the Winter Soldier implanted. As such, she managed to break the 107th out, and they begin shooting their way out of the building, but they're still outnumbered. And so Peggy immediately calls in for backup, and Steve answers as he flies in. And what does he fly in on? A metal suit. Yep. Steve Rogers is this world's Iron Man, or as they call him, the Hydra Buster. And yes, it is awesome. And actually, if I'm being honest, I thought that was cool. Believe it or not, there is a precedent in the comics for Steve Rogers being Iron Man in alternate universes. There is a comic called Bullet Points, and the premise of that comic is that Dr. Abraham Erskine was shot and killed 24 hours earlier than in the main timeline, resulting in Steve not getting the super soldier serum and having to find a different way to fight in the war. And so they wound up making him into that world's Iron Man. Although they didn't call him the Hydra Stomper there, he actually was Iron Man. There was a lot of other differences there, and admittedly, Bullet Points is a guilty pleasure of mine, so I will admit that it's not all perfect, but it's got a lot of interesting ideas, and admittedly, that was one of them. So, seeing that implemented here, and seeing Steve kicking so much ass in the Hydra Stomper armor, it's just great. As such, 107th is saved, and of course, just like in the main timeline, Peggy's exploits get commercialized, everyone loves her, everyone thinks she's awesome, and of course, right by her side the whole time is Steve Rogers in the Hydra Stomper armor. It ultimately does cause a little bit of friction between them, as in a later scene we see Peggy and Steve just kind of sitting at a diner and talking, and Steve does lament that Peggy, of course, is considered awesome now, whereas he's just a guy in a suit, and even then he probably isn't getting respect. But Peggy, of course, isn't hearing any of that. She tells Steve she is just as important as she is. That the suit isn't what makes him great, it's the man inside the suit. That he is her hero, a slip of the tongue. But Steve, of course, is touched and says that she is his hero too, resulting in the two having a moment where they almost kiss, and then it gets ruined by Howard and Bucky because apparently they wanted to go to a club, and Howard does immediately pick up that they were having a moment, and he urges them to keep going, but at that point it's just awkward. However, back in Germany, it seems that the Red Skull is still aching to become for godhood, as he has the carving of Yggdrasil, the World Tree, and he says that even though he doesn't have the Tesseract, godhood is still within his grasp. And while the Nazi agent that came to retrieve him says that he's clearly gone insane, of course, the Red Skull isn't hearing any of it, as he gets close to the guy and tells him that he will become greater and will ascend to godhood or whatever, and of course Red Skull just shoots the guy. And as the guy is dying on the floor, Red Skull peels off his mask, and we see the aforementioned Red Skull, with him proclaiming that Hydra will outlast the Third Reich, with all the soldiers there yelling out "Hail Hydra" as they pump their fists in the air. And of course, that's when Red Skull reveals that his plan isn't to use the Tesseract to power his soldiers, like in the main timeline. In this case, he wants to use the Tesseract to bring in a warrior of their own. Someone from beyond the stars that will be able to allow them to win. And of course, that brings us back to Peggy Carter and the Hydra Stomper, Steve Rogers. Just like in the main timeline, Peggy and her battalion end up trying to try and jump the train. In this case, it's not to get Zola, since they already have Zola, but it's because that there are rumors that the Red Skull is on that train. And of course, just like in the main timeline, Peggy and Steve and the rest of the battalion go onto the train, and this time, of course, Bucky is saved. Peggy managed to pull him up before he fell off the train. However, Steve goes in ahead of them and actually gets the front of the train. While they're waiting on top, Steve goes inside to see if he can find the Red Skull, only to find that in this timeline, it was a trap. The train is loaded with bombs. And just as Steve tells everyone, get out of here, it's a trap, the bombs go off and the train goes up. Peggy manages to get the battalion out of there, but unfortunately Steve is lost in the explosion. And unfortunately the explosion caused an avalanche, so before the group can go in to see if he's okay, they have to retreat so they don't get buried under the snow. Of course, the leading general is outraged that they lost the Hydra Stomper because, well, it's supposed to be indestructible, their greatest weapon, yada yada yada, but Peggy, of course, is overcome with grief and pissed. As such, while the guy is trying to rip Howard and Peggy a new one, Peggy walks away with just a look of "I will rip someone's effing head off" on her face as she goes to Zola's cell, and one cutaway later, it turns out that it's revealed that she interrogated him to find out where the Red Skull's base was, and so they managed to zero it down onto his castle. And so Peggy says that they gotta go in there, and they gotta stop the Red Skull and bring the war to an end. Of course, the general is a little bit ticked off about this, but Peggy reminds him that at this point, he kind of has no power. It's all them. So either he gets with the program, or he can leave. As such, he kind of shuts up, and Peggy says that they gotta do this for Steve, of which all soldiers there are in agreement. As such, Peggy and the 107th, including Bucky, of course, end up rushing to the castle and begin taking out soldiers, with Peggy and Howard, because she pretty much volunteered Howard herself to taking an upper path while the soldiers take a lower path. However, we then cut to the Red Skull in one of the labs, and we see that he has the Tesseract. And sure enough, as the 107th is going through the bottom layers of the castle, they find the Hydra Stomper armor all locked in place, and in its little ring, one of those rings. It looks like a frame. I forgot what it's called. Is it an X-frame? I don't think it's an X-frame, but you know what I'm talking about. It's like one of those things that Syndrome had in The Incredibles. And not far away from it is Steve chained up. I think that's a stupid decision, because what if he gets free? He could just jump back into the armor. Though to be fair, it's lacking its power source now, so whatever. But and while they do try to help Steve, he tells them, "I got to get back in the armor." In the meantime, we see Red Skull using the Tesseract to open a gateway, and of course that's when Peggy and Howard rush onto the scene. But the Red Skull tells them that they're too late, that Hydra's champion is coming through the gateway, and sure enough, from the gateway comes a giant mass of tentacles, and yeah, it's kind of horrifying. And of course, the Red Skull's like, "Yes, yes, Hydra's champion is here. We shall reign supreme, blah, blah, blah." And of course, the monster makes it clear that it doesn't work for him, as it immediately grabs the Red Skull in its tentacles and crushes him. So yeah, giant Cthulhu monster. The group, Peggy and Howard, quickly realize they're kind of effed. As such, Peggy does her best to fight off the tentacles, but it's clear that if they do not close this portal, this thing will come through, and with the way that the tentacles seem to be getting bigger, if all of it's allowed to come through, it could probably very easily take up most of Europe. So they got to get this thing closed, and Howard unfortunately is having problems since the control console's in German, so he has no idea what's what. In the meantime, the 107th do get Steve back into Hydra Stomper armor, and they do manage to power it up enough so that Steve is able to fly up to the higher levels and give Peggy a helping hand. However, even as they're able to fight off more of the creature's tentacles, it's still clear that it's still a major threat. Even when Peggy grabs a sword and starts chopping through them, this thing is not going down in one hit. This thing is just not going down. And to make matters worse, even when Howard does manage to find a way to deactivate the portal, this thing is not letting up, even managing to hold the portal open with its tentacles so that it can keep coming through. And so Peggy realizes that if they want this thing gone, they've got to force it back through. And so, just as Steve made the ultimate sacrifice in the main timeline, Peggy does as well, as she takes her shield and her sword and begins pushing back against the tentacles. Steve unfortunately cannot stop her, because unfortunately at that point the Hydra Stomper armor ran out of power, and he just tells her, "No, wait, don't do this," but she says she has to. And of course we get the same, well, we haven't gotten our dance, and just like with the main timeline, Peggy tells Steve that, yeah, we'll have our dance about next Saturday. It's just as in the main timeline, it's just as heartbreaking, and so with that final statement, Peggy manages to push the monster through the portal, going through herself and closing it up. The end result is a massive explosion which destroys most of the castle, but thankfully Steve and Howard are safe, with 107th having already been transported away by Steve. As such, Steve looks at the Tesseract as it just rests there, and it's clear that he's still taking time to register this, as he grips with the loss of the woman he loved. And then, of course, we cut to years later, as we see Nick So you remember how in Avengers, how Nick Fury had the Tesseract and was toying with it to try see if they could tap into it? Well, the same thing happened here, except in this case, they actually activate the Tesseract and intentionally open a portal, and from that portal comes the remains of the massive tentacles, and Peggy just jumping out with her sword and shield in hand. And of course, when she comes out, there's Nick Fury there to greet her, only with Clint Barton by her side. And of course, once Peggy comes out, her first question is, "Where's Steve?" And so Nick tells her, the war's over. It's been over for 70 years. And you can just see Peggy just you can just see Peggy, like, break a little. Like, her face just turns more solemn, and then she just says with a forced smile, "Yeah, we won the war." And that's where the episode ends, as the Watcher gives his final farewells, talking about how he watches but must never interfere. And and thus the episode is over. So overall, I thought it was fun. I'm not gonna lie, I don't think it was a great first outing, but honestly, I think that problem kind of comes from the rushed nature of it. It feels like this episode is trying to condense the Captain America: The First Avenger down to one episode, and as a consequence of that, it does feel rushed. I will admit, if you're watching this episode, the best way you can enjoy it is if you've seen Captain America: The First Avenger. If you haven't seen that, then none of this is going to get you as none of this is probably going to hit you as hard as it should be. With that being said, though, even with that rush nature, it's still a lot of fun. It's cool seeing the various parallels between this episode and Captain America: The First Avenger. How seeing things connect to with each other, seeing how they're similar enough to the main, seeing how things. It's nice seeing the parallels between this and the main timeline, like seeing events correspond, like with Peggy as Captain Carter charging in to save the 107th, like with Steve in the main timeline, or how she leads the 107th to attack that train. But of course, it's also nice seeing how they differ. In this case, because Captain Carter took a much higher initiative than Steve did, in this case, before she took her show tour, I'm gonna just say. In this case, she decided, screw it, I'm gonna go out there anyway. Damn my orders. And so she managed to intercept the Tesseract before the Red Skull could get his hands on it, resulting in Hydra losing those great weapons that they would have had that would have given them the leg up. That would have given them a leg up in the war. And of course, because Peggy charged in early enough to go after the 107th, because by that point she had already garnered enough support, she was able to save them before Bucky could get the hypnotic commands implanted into his head that would have eventually made him the Winter Soldier. So I liked seeing stuff like that. And again, because she got the Tesseract early enough, it allowed Howard to reverse engineer it and use it, in this case, to give this world its first Iron Man, the Hydra Stomper. And yes, it is awesome seeing Steve kicking ass in that thing. And of course, it still showcases that regardless of the universe, Steve's heart will always be in the right place, because he is still charging in, ready to do battle. He's still a shrimpy guy, and while his confidence does take a bit of a break, does get a slight beating because he's still the shrimp while Peggy got his glory, he's still okay with it because he loves Peggy. Peggy is still there for him, and he's still there for her. And Peggy reminds him, it's not the armor, it's you. You're kicking ass in that thing. You're awesome. It's really nice still seeing that despite the fact that their roles are kind of reversed in this world, their relationship is still strong. And ultimately, it's Peggy who has to deal with the survivor skill because she's the one that makes the ultimate sacrifice in this universe. Only in this case, instead of being trapped in an iceberg for 70 years, she instead got sent to some other area of space. And whatever the time difference is between one gateway and the next, it's clear that for her, no time has passed. She is still the same woman she was 70 years prior, and by the time she's returned to the world, everything and everyone she loved is either gone or very old. So it still has the same impact that the Captain America the First Avenger did when Steve realized he was in modern day New York. So I like that, at least. I do like that. And again, it's still really nice to see more of how this world differs from the main timeline and just kind of seeing how things work out. I do like seeing Peggy being more proactive. It's still cool seeing that. And of course, it's also interesting to see how the Red Skull plans around this. Like, in this case, seeing how things are going differently. Like, again, going back to the train sequence. In the main timeline, of course, that went to hell as well. But in that timeline, they at least were able to reconcile things by getting Zola, and thus were able to used his situation as a bargaining chip. Like Captain Rogers lost his friend. He's not in a good mood. Either tell us what you want or you're screwed. And here they've had Zola from the beginning. Lord knows why they didn't interrogate him before now. But in this case, there is no win. They went in, and while they didn't lose Bucky, they lost Steve, and it's a crushing blow. It's still really nice to see that, and of course, seeing all this come together, it's all really nice. And to also give another compliment to the series, I love the animation. It's a nice mix of CGI and hand drawn animation, and it really blends well, capturing the likeness of the actors from the MCU very well, and providing some really great fast paced action. And because it's animation, they're allowed to do things that they probably wouldn't be able to do in film, or at the very least, if they did do it in film, it would be with CGI. In this case, again, giant tentacle monster coming from the portal, which I swear to God was Cthulhu. And of course, the voice acting is also really good. In this case, especially in the case of Steve Rogers, because as you probably know, they did not get the original actor back for Steve Rogers. They did not get Chris Evans back to reprise his role. However, the guy they did get back actually does a good job. It's Josh Keaton, by the way. Yeah, I don't know why I did that pause there. I like Josh Keaton. He does really great work, and he does a great job portraying Steve Rogers in this. So, yeah, I have to mention that. And again, and it still does have some good humor here and there, like when the 107th sees the Hydra Stomper fly in and start kicking ass. They think, holy, it's like, wait, is she friends with him? And then Bucky's like, I think I am too. Or when the 107th manages to power up the Hydra Stomper armor after Steve gets in it. It's like, Steve, are you okay? Then it's just like, it doesn't move, and then bong, it just falls. That's funny. It's still got the humor that the MCU is known for. But again, overall though, it's just a fun little jaunt. At the end of the day, I think its biggest problem though is that it does feel like Captain America: The First Avenger abridged. While there are some things that differ, the plot, for the most part, is still relatively the same, but kind of more condensed and a bit more rushed. It still does allow for the emotional moments between Peggy and Steve, but this episode really relies on the fact that you've seen Captain America: The First Avenger to understand. And to be fair, that's not always a bad thing. It's nice to use a frame of reference, and even other stories in What If have done that before, where they say, oh, you know how the story goes, so we're just going to cut to the parts that are important for this one. So, this episode did that rather well, but otherwise, the rush nature is kind of a problem, especially if you haven't seen Captain America: The First Avenger. Though I would argue that if you are watching this episode at all, odds are you've at least seen that. So I'll give it flack for maybe the rush nature and condensed storytelling in that regard, and which does cut out some of the emotional moments, especially with Peggy Carter. It does definitely feel like Howard is pushing more, especially when he already has the shield already, whereas in the main timeline, Steve had to specially ask for the shield because Howard apparently said we used all the material to make that one. But overall, though, the episode is just all right. It's a fun little jaunt, and that explores the avenues of what if. It hits many of the same moments that Captain America: The First Avenger hit with Captain Carter in place of Captain America. It's still got really humor. The animation is kick-ass. The voice acting is amazing. How this differs from the main timeline is really interesting, as well as how it's the same to the main timeline. I like seeing the alterations and changes. I liked seeing Steve in the Hydra Buster armor. I liked seeing Peggy in the Captain Carter costume. I liked seeing them fight the Cthulhu monster, as that's a nice way of kind of going in a different path than what the Red Skull did in the main timeline. So overall, I think episode 1 of the series is pretty decent. Just all right. A fun little jaunt, but if you're going to watch it, you need to have seen the movie first. So, yeah. Again, overall, pretty good. Enjoyed myself, so, yeah. That's about it. Thank you for watching. I'm Samuel Johnson, and I'll see you next week when episode 2 of Marvel's What If drops. So, until then, have a great week, and take care. See ya.